There's a specific moment empaths describe when they talk about the end of their old life. They don't describe a breakdown or a dramatic event. They describe something quieter, something that happened in an ordinary moment, standing at the kitchen sink, or sitting in traffic, or lying in bed staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning. They describe the sensation of something inside them unclenching, like a fist they didn't know they'd been making for decades, finally, slowly, finger by finger, opening. And once it opened, they couldn't close it again. They didn't want to. The thing they'd been gripping so tightly had already dissolved somewhere between the holding and the releasing, and all that was left was an open hand with nothing in it, and the strange, terrifying freedom of having nothing left to hold on to. Jung spent years working with patients who reached this exact threshold. He watched them arrive at sessions looking different, not brighter, not more peaceful in the way self-help culture imagines peace. They looked hollowed out in a way that concerned him at first, like something essential had been removed. Their eyes had a quality he struggled to name in his notes, something between exhaustion and a clarity so total it almost looked vacant from the outside. He learned, over time, that what he was witnessing wasn't emptiness. It was the aftermath of a release so complete that the person sitting in front of him was, in a very real psychological sense, someone new. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about this final phase, the letting go that marks the true end of the empath's awakening. What's actually being released, because it's almost never what people think. Why this phase feels like death to the person going through it, and what emerges on the other side of a grip that lasted a lifetime. To understand why the final letting go is so devastating, you have to understand what empaths are actually holding on to. And this is where Jung's observations get uncomfortable. Because the thing empaths grip the hardest is the thing they believe makes them good. Every empath builds their identity around a specific psychological architecture. The person who feels deeply, the person who understands others, the person who shows up, who holds space, who absorbs pain so the people around them don't have to carry it alone. This identity feels like a core truth, like the most authentic thing about them. When an empath says, "I've always been this way," they mean it. They can trace it back to childhood, to the earliest moments they can remember, the sensitivity, the awareness of other people's emotional states, the instinct to help, to soothe, to fix. It feels like who they are at the molecular level. Jung recognized this identity as something more complicated. He saw that the empath's identity as a healer, a feeler, a caretaker, while genuinely reflecting real abilities, had been constructed under duress. The child who became the family's emotional barometer didn't choose that role. The daughter who learned to read her mother's moods before she could read words didn't develop that skill recreationally. The son who absorbed his father's rage to protect his siblings wasn't practicing empathy as a spiritual gift. These were children whose survival depended on becoming exquisitely tuned to the emotional states of unstable adults. The sensitivity was real, the abilities were genuine, but the identity built on top of them was, in Jung's framework, a persona, a mask that formed so early it fused with the face underneath. And this is what the final letting go demands: releasing the mask you've confused with your face. This realization typically arrives late in the awakening process. The empath has already done significant work by this point. They've recognized toxic patterns, they've learned about boundaries, maybe even started setting them. They've identified narcissistic dynamics, started untangling from codependent relationships, begun to understand their attachment wounds. They've read the books, maybe done therapy, developed real psychological insight, and they've made genuine progress. The people around them can see the change, but something still doesn't land. There's a layer underneath all that work that hasn't been touched, and the empath can feel it like a stone at the bottom of a well, present, heavy, unreachable by the tools that worked on everything above it. The books don't address it. The boundary setting doesn't resolve it. The insight doesn't dissolve it. It just sits there, this deep, persistent ache that all the healing work in the world seems to circle around without ever quite reaching. What's sitting at the bottom of that well is the original bargain, The deal the child made when they were too young to know they were making it. The bargain that said, "I will feel everything so that the people around me don't have to. I will take responsibility for the emotional climate of every room I enter. I will make myself indispensable through my sensitivity, because being needed is the closest thing to being safe that I've ever known." That bargain became the foundation of everything. Every relationship, every friendship, every career choice, every self-concept, all of it built on the premise that the empath's value comes from their ability to feel, absorb, and manage other people's emotional reality. And the final letting go is the moment the empath realizes that bargain has to end, that the very thing they've been calling their gift is also the chain that's been keeping them locked in a life designed around everyone else's needs. This is where people get stuck. Because how do you release something that feels like the best part of who you are? This stage often begins with a period he described as profound disorientation. The empath starts losing interest in things that used to drive them. The urge to help, which once felt like oxygen, starts feeling like a weight. Conversations with people who used to fascinate them, people with complex problems, dramatic situations, emotional intensity, begin to feel draining in a way they never did before. The empath might describe it as feeling selfish or cold or broken. They'll say things like, "I don't know what's wrong with me," or "I used to care so much and now I feel like I can't access it." What Jung recognized in these descriptions was the beginning of a dismantling. The psyche was withdrawing energy from the old identity structure, the healer, feeler, absorber persona, and the empath was interpreting that withdrawal as something going wrong. But the psyche wasn't malfunctioning. It was doing exactly what it needed to do. It was loosening the grip. Think about what it takes to actually let go of something you've held for 30 or 40 years. The muscles in your hand have shaped themselves around the object. The tendons have shortened. The grip has become the hand's resting state. Releasing isn't just opening your fingers. It's reorganizing the entire structure of your hand. It hurts. The muscles cramp and resist. The hand feels wrong when it's open because closed has been its shape for so long. That's what's happening psychologically when the empath enters this final phase. The identity is reorganizing, and reorganization doesn't feel like growth or healing or enlightenment. It feels like falling apart. Jung observed that his patients in this phase would often cycle through grief, rage, and a strange flatness that alarmed the people around them. The grief made sense to outside observers. The empath was clearly mourning something. But the rage confused people, because it seemed to come from nowhere and to point in every direction at once. The empath would feel furious at their parents, at former partners, at friends, at society, at themselves. A diffuse, burning anger that didn't seem to have a clear target. What Jung understood was that the rage had a very clear target. The empath was angry about the bargain itself, angry that they'd spent their life pouring themselves out for people who never asked what they needed, angry that their sensitivity had been exploited by every system they'd ever been part of: family, romantic relationships, friendships, workplaces. Angry that they'd been so good at absorbing everyone else's pain that nobody ever noticed they were drowning. And underneath the anger was something even harder to face. The recognition that they'd participated. They'd volunteered for the role. They'd chosen relationships that needed them to overfunction. They'd built a life that required their self-abandonment because self-abandonment was the only way they knew how to be close to people. The empath has to sit with the devastating truth that they were both the one being used and the one who kept showing up to be used, and that both of those things can be true simultaneously without canceling each other out. Jung called this shadow integration as it applied to the healer archetype. The empath has to see their own shadow, the part of them that needed to be needed, the part that derived identity and purpose from other people's dysfunction, the part that unconsciously sought out broken people because broken people never leave someone who's willing to carry their pain. Seeing this doesn't erase the genuine harm that was done to them. Their wounds are real. The exploitation was real. But the empath's own participation in the cycle is also real, and the final letting go requires acknowledging all of it. This is the part where most people turn back. The grief is bearable, even the rage can be processed, But seeing your own complicity in the patterns that destroyed you, that's the piece that makes people retreat to the familiar identity and close the fist again. Because if I'm just a healer, if I'm just sensitive, if the problem was always other people taking advantage of my gift, then I can stay in the story I know. The moment I see that I co-created the dynamic, the story collapses, and with it, the identity. The empaths who made it through this confrontation, who sat with the full, ugly, complicated truth of their own psychology without running back to the comfortable version, entered a state he associated with genuine individuation. They stopped being the person their wound had shaped them into, and started becoming whoever they actually were underneath all of it. But here's what nobody warns you about. You don't know who that person is. You've spent your entire life being the feeler, the healer, the one who holds space. Strip that away and there's a blank underneath. The empath in this phase often describes feeling like they have no personality, no preferences, no identity. They don't know what they like because they've spent decades focused on what other people need. They don't know what they want because wanting felt dangerous in a childhood where wanting got you punished or ignored. They don't know who they are without someone else's pain to orient them, and the disorientation is absolute. Jung would have called this the liminal space, the threshold between the old self and whatever comes next, and he was very clear that this space cannot be rushed through. The empath who tries to fill the blank immediately, who jumps into a new identity or a new relationship or a new mission before the old identity has fully dissolved, that empath will just rebuild the same architecture with different furniture. The fist closes around something new, but the grip is the same. The work of this phase is tolerating the emptiness, sitting with open hands, and resisting the urge to grab onto something, anything, just to feel solid again. Jung described individuation as a process that requires periods of apparent nothingness, where the conscious mind has let go of the old structure, but the new one hasn't emerged yet. And these periods feel wrong. They feel like depression, like stagnation, like something has gone terribly off track. Every instinct says, do something, be something, help someone, find a purpose. And the work is to let those instincts pass without acting on them. If you've been doing this work, if you've been reading, reflecting, sitting with the difficult parts of what you're discovering about yourself, and you're looking for something that meets you where you are right now, our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings. It was built for exactly this kind of passage, the kind where you need something practical to hold on to while the old identity is dissolving. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. What emerges on the other side of the emptiness is what Jung spent his career trying to describe. He used different language at different points: the self, individuation, psychological wholeness. But the empaths who made it through this phase described it in simpler terms. They said things like, I finally feel like I'm living my own life, or I can be in a room full of people and still feel like myself, or, most frequently, I stopped disappearing. That last one, I stopped disappearing, captures something essential about what the final letting go actually accomplishes. The empath who hasn't gone through this process disappears constantly. They disappear into other people's emotions. They disappear into caretaking. They disappear into the performance of sensitivity. They're so attuned to everyone else's frequency that their own signal gets lost in the noise. They walk into a room and immediately become a mirror for whatever emotional energy is present. And by the time they leave, they can't find their own reflection anywhere. The empath who's been through the final letting go still perceives all of that. The sensitivity doesn't vanish. The ability to read rooms, sense emotions, detect patterns, all of it remains intact. But there's a crucial difference. They stay present inside their own experience while perceiving everyone else's. They feel the room's energy without merging with it. They sense someone's pain without absorbing it into their body. They perceive the emotional truth of a situation while maintaining a clear, steady sense of their own separate existence. Jung described this as the development of what he called a strong ego container, a sense of self sturdy enough to hold its shape in the presence of powerful external forces. The old empath had a permeable ego boundary, like a cell membrane that let everything through. Emotions, energy, other people's unconscious material. It all flooded in because there was nothing to keep it out. The empath who's completed the final letting go has a boundary that's selective. They can choose what to let in and what to keep out. They can open when opening serves them and close when closing is necessary. The membrane has become functional. This is what makes this phase feel like losing your gift. Because the old way of being empathic was total immersion, feeling everything for everyone all the time. And the new way feels muted by comparison. You're still perceiving, but you're not drowning in it anymore. You're still sensitive, but the sensitivity has edges now, boundaries, a shape. And because the overwhelming flood was what you'd always called empathy, the contained version feels like something has been taken from you. Jung would tell you that what was taken from you was the dysfunction, and what remains is the actual ability. The flood wasn't empathy. It was a trauma response wearing empathy's name. The ability to feel everything for everyone without any filter isn't a gift. It's a wound that never healed. The real gift is perception with sovereignty, sensing accurately while remaining whole, seeing clearly while staying yourself. But the world doesn't always celebrate this version of the empath. And this is something Jung observed with genuine concern. The empath who lets go, who stops absorbing, stops overperforming care, stops being available as everyone's emotional processing center, disrupts every system they've ever been part of. Families notice first. You've changed, they'll say. You're so distant now. Friends notice next. You never listen like you used to. Partners notice last, usually because the empath has already started withdrawing from the relationship by the time the partner registers that something's different. What's actually happening is that the empath has stopped performing a function that everyone around them had come to depend on. They were the emotional load bearer for entire systems, family systems, friend groups, workplaces, and now they've put the load down, and nobody else wants to pick it up. So the system pushes back, tries to guilt the empath into resuming the role, frames the empath's health as selfishness and their boundaries as abandonment. Jung documented this pushback extensively. He noted that one of the most painful aspects of individuation is the social cost. The people who loved the old you, or more accurately, the people who loved what the old you did for them, will resist the new you with everything they have. They'll use language designed to trigger the empath's deepest fears. You're being selfish. You're abandoning me. You don't care anymore. You've become cold. And every one of those accusations will hit exactly where the empath is most vulnerable. Because the empath's greatest terror has always been becoming the kind of person who doesn't care. Here's the part that separates the empath who makes it through from the one who doesn't. The one who doesn't make it hears, "You've become selfish," and panics. They feel the accusation land in the center of their identity, and they close their fist again. They grab the old role, pick the load back up, resume the performance. The relief is immediate. The system calms down, the relationships stabilize, the guilt subsides. But the cost is everything. They've traded their own emergence for other people's comfort, and something inside them knows it. The flatness returns. The exhaustion returns. The sense of living someone else's life returns, and the window that was briefly open closes again, sometimes for good. The one who makes it through hears, "You've become selfish," and feels the same panic, but stays with it. They let the accusation land without acting on it. They sit with the guilt and the fear and the terrible possibility that maybe the people saying these things are right. Maybe they have become cold. Maybe something is wrong with them. And they stay in that uncertainty long enough for the truth to surface. The people calling them selfish are people who benefited from their self-abandonment. The accusation isn't a reflection of the empath's character. It's a reflection of the accuser's loss of supply. Seeing this clearly is one of the most difficult perceptual shifts in the entire awakening process. Because the empath's nervous system was wired in childhood to interpret another person's distress as a command. Someone is hurting, therefore I must help. Someone is upset with me, therefore I must change. The signal and the response are fused together at the neurological level, and separating them, learning to perceive someone's distress without automatically assigning yourself responsibility for fixing it, requires a kind of psychological rewiring that takes time and feels deeply unnatural. Jung compared this rewiring to learning a new language in adulthood. The old language, feel, absorb, fix, is fluent, automatic, effortless. The new language, perceive, contain, choose, is halting, awkward, requires conscious effort for every interaction. There will be months, maybe years, where the empath feels like they're translating in real time. Someone expresses need, and the old response fires instantly, help them. Then, a beat later, the new awareness catches up. Wait, is this mine to carry? And there's a gap between the impulse and the choice that feels agonizing, because in that gap, the empath has to tolerate someone else's discomfort without rushing to resolve it. That gap is where the transformation lives. Every time the empath stays in the gap instead of collapsing it by reverting to the old pattern, the new wiring strengthens. The pause between stimulus and response gets more natural. The translation becomes less effortful. And eventually, the empath discovers something remarkable. They can witness pain without being consumed by it. They can love someone without carrying their burden. They can be present without being annihilated. This is what Jung would have called the birth of the conscious empath. Someone who possesses all the perceptual sensitivity they've always had, but has developed the psychological infrastructure to use it deliberately instead of being used by it. Their empathy becomes a tool rather than a condition, something they can direct, calibrate, and, critically, withdraw when withdrawal is the wisest response. And this is where the letting go reveals itself as something other than loss, because the empath who reaches this point doesn't experience their life as emptier than before. They experience it as theirs for the first time. The relationships that remain are relationships where they're seen as a full person, not a function. The connections they form are connections built on reciprocity rather than the empath's willingness to overperform care. Their sensitivity, freed from the compulsion to serve everyone else's needs, turns inward for the first time and starts serving their own life, their own creativity, their own joy, their own depth. Jung noticed that patients in this late stage of individuation often experienced a surge of creativity, interest, and aliveness that surprised them. Hobbies emerged that had nothing to do with helping anyone. Curiosities surfaced that were entirely their own. Laughter came more easily, not because life was simpler, but because the empath had more energy available for living when they weren't spending all of it managing everyone else's inner world. There's a particular quality of presence that these empaths develop, and Jung wrote about it repeatedly in different contexts. It's a kind of warmth that has weight to it, a groundedness that makes people feel safe in their company without the empath doing anything to create that safety. The old empath created safety by absorbing, by taking the other person's difficult emotions into their own body so the other person could feel lighter. The transformed empath creates safety simply by being steady. Their presence communicates, I can be with you in this without needing to fix it, take it from you, or make it go away. And paradoxically, this kind of presence, the non-absorbing, non-rescuing kind, is far more healing for the other person than the old version ever was. Because when someone absorbs your pain, they're subtly communicating that your pain is too much for you to handle. They're stepping in as a surrogate processor, which reinforces the belief that you can't process your own emotions. When someone is simply present with you in your pain, steady, warm, unhurried, unburdened by it, they're communicating something radically different. You can carry this. I trust you to carry this. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere, and you are strong enough to feel what you feel. That distinction is something Jung considered essential to the difference between genuine healing and codependent caretaking. And the empath can only offer that genuine presence after they've stopped gripping the old identity. As long as they're still fused with the role of healer-absorber, their presence will always carry the implicit message, give me your pain, I'll take care of it. After the letting go, the message changes. And the people who encounter this version of the empath feel it immediately, even if they can't articulate what's different. Some relationships will survive this transition, the ones that were already rooted in genuine connection rather than function. The friend who liked you, actually you, the person underneath the helper, will still be there, maybe even more present than before, because now they're getting the real version instead of the performance. The partner who fell in love with who you are rather than what you do will feel the shift and lean into it. These relationships deepen in ways the empath didn't know were possible, because for the first time, the empath is showing up as a full person with needs and desires and edges and preferences, and the connection is built on that realness instead of on the empath's self-erasure. Other relationships will end, and the empath has to let them. This is perhaps the final test of the letting go. Watching the people who needed the old version of you realize that that version isn't coming back and choosing to leave. Or watching yourself outgrow relationships that can only hold the version of you that didn't take up space. These losses are real, and they hurt, and there's no Jungian framework that makes them painless. The grief of losing people you loved, or people you thought you loved, before you understood that what you called love was actually just the fear of being unnecessary. That grief has to be honored. It has to be felt all the way through, without rushing it toward resolution or silver lining it into something more comfortable. Jung was clear that individuation always involves loss. You cannot become who you actually are without shedding who you were pretending to be, and some people were only connected to the pretense. Letting them go is part of the process, and the ache of their absence is evidence that something real is happening, that the reorganization has reached the relational level and is doing its work there too. If any of this is landing somewhere deep, if you're in this passage right now, feeling the grip loosening and terrified of what happens when your hand is fully open, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was designed for this exact territory. 24 reflection exercises grounded in Jung's work, built for the person in the middle of becoming someone they don't fully recognize yet. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. There's one more dimension of this final phase that Jung addressed, and it's the one people rarely talk about because it's the most disorienting. After the old identity dissolves, after the grief and the rage and the blankness, after the new way of being starts to solidify, the empath encounters a kind of loneliness they've never experienced before. And it's different from the loneliness they knew in their old life. The old loneliness was the loneliness of being surrounded by people who didn't see you, of being useful but not known, of being everyone's support system but nobody's priority. That loneliness had a familiar ache to it, and it was manageable in its way because it was constant. It was the background radiation of the empath's life, always present, rarely examined. The new loneliness is different. It's the loneliness of being seen by yourself and realizing how few people in your life can meet you where you actually are. It's the loneliness of clear perception. You see the patterns in the people around you. You recognize the dynamics playing out in your family, your workplace, your social circles. You understand, with a precision that sometimes feels unbearable, why people do what they do and why they can't stop doing it. And you can't unsee any of it. You've released the comfortable blur that made it possible to participate in performances you now recognize as performances. Jung associated this loneliness with the later stages of individuation and was honest that it doesn't fully resolve. The conscious person will always experience a degree of isolation that the unconscious person is spared, because consciousness is, at its core, an act of separation. You separate from the collective fog. You separate from shared delusions. You separate from the comfort of pretending everything is fine when you can see clearly that it's not. And each act of separation creates distance between you and the people who are still living inside what you've left behind. But, and Jung was insistent about this, the loneliness of consciousness is qualitatively different from the loneliness of unconsciousness. The old loneliness was a hunger, an aching need for connection that could never be satisfied because the empath was offering a function rather than a self, and functions can't truly connect with anyone. The new loneliness is more like solitude, a spaciousness that can feel empty when you're not used to it, but that gradually reveals itself as the foundation for a kind of connection the empath has never experienced before. Connection that doesn't require you to disappear. Connection that doesn't cost you your identity. Connection that asks you to show up as yourself, all of yourself, including the difficult parts, the parts that have edges, and to let that be enough. The empath who reaches this point has completed something rare. They've taken an ability that was forged in trauma, that was hijacked by survival, that was exploited by every system they were part of, and they've reclaimed it. They've separated the genuine perceptual gift from the wound that shaped it and the identity that formed around it. What remains is something powerful and clean, the ability to perceive deeply, to sense what others often can't, to understand emotional and psychological reality with unusual accuracy. All of it now in service to a self that actually exists, a self that has preferences and desires and limits and depth, a self that doesn't need to earn its place by performing a function. The final irony, which Jung documented with something that reads almost like amusement in his notes, is that the empath who stops trying to heal everyone becomes, by virtue of their transformed presence, far more healing than they ever were before. The desperate, absorbing, self-abandoning version of the empath, the one who took on everyone's pain and called it love, was actually perpetuating cycles of dependence and dysfunction. The grounded, contained, sovereign version, the one who can be present without merging, who can perceive without absorbing, who can love without losing themselves, creates space for genuine transformation in the people around them. Simply by being whole, they give others permission to pursue wholeness. Simply by refusing to carry what isn't theirs, they force others to build the capacity to carry their own weight. And this is what makes the final letting go so worth the agony of the passage. The empath doesn't lose their sensitivity. They lose the prison that their sensitivity became. They don't stop feeling. They stop hemorrhaging. They don't become cold. They become warm with edges, capable of real intimacy precisely because they've stopped confusing intimacy with self-dissolution. The fist that was closed for decades is finally open, and the hand that emerges is capable of things the fist never was, capable of reaching without grasping, capable of holding without clinging, capable of touching the world gently, deliberately, on its own terms. If you're in this passage, if the grip is loosening and you're terrified of what you'll be without the thing you've been holding, Jung would tell you to let the fear be there and keep opening anyway. The identity dissolving in your hands was never the real you. It was the shape your survival took in a world that asked too much of you too young. What's underneath it? What's been underneath it this entire time, waiting for you to stop performing long enough to feel it, is worth every ounce of grief the letting go demands. You're not losing yourself. You're finding yourself. And the finding doesn't look like light and angels and transcendence. It looks like an ordinary person standing in their kitchen at 2 a.m, feeling the last of the old identity loosen its grip, and choosing, finally, fully, irreversibly, to let it go. That's the last phase of awakening. That's what Jung spent his career trying to articulate. And if you're living it right now, you're not falling apart, you're falling into place. If you haven't yet, check out our guide, True Self-Discovery. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, built for the exact passage you're in. The one where the old self is dissolving and the new one hasn't fully arrived yet. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.